Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to tonight's St. Mary's County Library presentation called The French and Indian War. And this program is the second part in our series called On the Eve of the American Revolution. And tonight's speaker is Dr. Jim Gibb.
Um, so I was originally planning on talking about the French and Indian War this evening, and then I realized I had way too much material to do it just one night. So I'm altering the schedule a little bit. We're going to talk about part one this evening, which is the French and Indian War, where it kind of started in terms of military in Maryland, Pennsylvania. I guess you can include Virginia as well. And then next month I'll deal with part two, which will be the Northern Theater, New York State, Massachusetts, and Acadia, Nova Scotia, um, which is a very interesting story, and not a very pleasant story either. I'm trying to do as much of this in terms of archaeology as I can, because you may hear a lot about the French and Indian War, but rarely does anybody deal with it from an archaeological perspective. So, with that said, it occurred to me when I started this series last month, I was talking about what Maryland was like just before these events began to unfold. And it occurred to me that I hadn't actually provided any kind of theme, something that unites the half dozen talks together. So here it is, and that is the principles embodied in the Declaration of Independence, developed over 150 years of European settlement of Great Britain's 13 colonies, always within or in the shadow of the Anglo-French colonial wars, of which there are a number of them. And the French and Indian War, from North American perspective, is the last. Events during and after the French and Indian War distilled those ideas. That is, as I talking with subsequent talks, you're going to start to see where some of the things that we finally see in the Declaration of Independence really start to develop. And that's really important because we tend to think of, the Declaration as something that Jefferson sat down, banged out in a couple of days, got a little criticism, but basically it was largely accepted as is, and that was that. But those ideas were a long time in coming, and they were refined. And so that's one of the things I want to look at through this series. Events during and after the French and Indian War distill those ideas. This series explores those documents and archaeological research. So, folks, if you have you might want to mute your microphones.
There we go. Up.
Okay.
This one.
All right.
Not the top.
Guys, do mute your microphones. Okay. There are a series of colonial wars, the first of which was called the War of the Grand Alliance, or King William's War. King William and his Queen Mary were first rulers after the ouster of King James in the 1690s. King William was basically a Dutchman. The War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War. The War of Austrian Succession, King George's War. I should say King George II's War. Are you seeing a theme here? Every ruler seems to need a war. And then the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, which was King George II and King George III. King George III assumed the throne in 1760, and he's the one who we all revolted against. And then, of course, the American Revolution. But these are wars of where Great Britain and France are fighting for control of really North America and the Caribbean, because this part of the world was a gold mine for them. So a map, and I'm not going to have references for where some of these things came from because I haven't had time to bother with it. Kind of a lame excuse, but they come from sundry sources, and I'll point out when they're not mine, and this is not mine. But this map shows you about how things were sorted out prior to the French and Indian War, prior to, let's say, 1755. And you could see that large blue expanse the Canadian Maritimes right down to the Gulf of Mexico. In the latest war, the 1740s, Britain won some concessions, and so some portions of French territory became British. Those are the ones you see in purple. And then, of course, the British colonies from Maine down to Georgia. And of course, the Spaniards in the Southwest, Mexico, and Florida. So I want to start talking about what was really what's generally regarded as the first shots fired in the French and Indian War. And we'll talk about some of the people and places involved. It starts with this guy, Major George Washington. You may recall that, well, you probably are unaware of this bit of history. He led a party of Virginians at the request of the then governor of Virginia. And they were supposed to go to Fort Duquesne, what we now know as Pittsburgh. And what Washington, well, actually, he was supposed to head north of there, but what Washington was supposed to do was to deliver a letter, basically an eviction notice, from the governor of Virginia to the French. He ended up handing that off to a French officer who would then hand it on to his superior. During this episode, Washington and his party essentially ambushed a group of French and Indians, killing a French officer, and I think there were a total of about 12 who died. So he skirmished with them at a place known as Jumonville Glen in 1754, and you can find that on a map. The place still exists. The French and Indians, not surprisingly, were annoyed, and they chased after him. And Washington knew they were going to chase after him. So he headed back towards Virginia, ended up stopping in Great Meadows, where I think he'd already started building a fort. And he took his stand there. He had his people throw together a fort where they had to face a much larger contingent of French and Indians. And what you will see, I'll show you some images, was essentially an indefensible position. Washington ended up negotiating a surrender. Again, this is in May, early June of 1754. And that allowed, the surrender allowed him to return to Virginia with his arms, his weapons. They were harassed by the Indians quite a bit, who were basically plundering their wagon train, if you will. The French ended up burning the fort and returning to Fort Duquesne, which again is essentially modern-day Pittsburgh. So to give you a sense of where these locations are, Fort Necessity in Great Meadows is in southwestern Pennsylvania, just north of the Maryland border. You can visit this place. There's National Park there, National Historic Park. You could, of course, visit Fort Duquesne, but I don't think there's anything left of it. It's completely buried by this modern city of Pittsburgh. We do have a map provided by Washington, kind of laying out his route. I have only recently found this. It's no great discovery. Other people have known about it, but it's just recently come to my attention, and I haven't had the chance to analyze it yet. I need a higher resolution copy so I could see what it actually says. But this is part of Washington's report about his mission to the French. But on a modern map, you can see this. There are a number of people over the years, particularly about 10, 15 years ago, who are looking for traces of Braddock's Road. But on this map, you can see the Visitor Center for Fort Necessity. There's a reconstructed fort there. And of course, Route 40, the old National Road, takes you up to the Jumonville Road, which takes you north to where Washington initially ambushed the French and Indians. So we have a map. These things have been put together by a number of people. They're different versions, but this is a pretty good one. It shows you approximately how the fort supposedly was shaped. It even has meets and bounds, south 80 degrees west, 99 feet. This side here, the fort, 99 feet. This side here, 115 feet. So it was a small fort. But I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. Behind the fort, there's basically a creek and a meadow. And at the time when this altercation occurred, they had been experiencing a lot of rain. So these lowlands to the left, the great meadows behind, were just sodden. It was mud. On the other, to the south, where this you can see this kind of ill-defined, but these are supposed to be upland areas, forested uplands. So these elevations are higher than the fort. So anybody knows anything about military history or tactics would take a look at this and go, what was he thinking? Because he set up this fort below this high ground in the middle of a swampy area. I mean, granted, his rear was and left flank or right flank would have been well protected because of the mud, but he was open to rifle fire from above. And here you can see, this is a typical on these kinds of maps where they show units. This is Washington's first position, so this is his initial defensive position, and then if he got in trouble, he can retreat back into the fort. There are a bunch of images out there that, obviously nobody was on site taking pictures at the time or doing paintings, but these are different views of what people thought it looked like in 1754. And you could just barely make out the fort in the background, some Native Americans, Washington. There's a field artillery piece with a bunch of cannonballs. And this is supposed to represent Washington kind of thinking it over. Is he going to surrender or not? Here we have an outline of the fort, and this was developed from excavations by a National Park Service archaeologist, Gene Harrington. He usually went by the name of Pinky. He pinked up in the sun. He did the initial trenching to identify portions of the earthworks that constitute the fort. And that's those little black areas you see there. Those are elements of the trenches, the earthworks that he found. So you've got an outer work. And the inner work, that circular thing, was presumably to protect, well, it was supposed to protect his stores, ammunition, apparently also liquor. And there's some discussion as to whether that structure around it was meant to protect the arms and other stores from the French and Indians, or if it was to keep his own men out of the liquor. I can go either way on that. And here's a photograph from 1957 showing what some of that fortification looked like. Those black things are the bases of posts set in the ground that constituted the stockade. And he essentially re-excavated the trench that Washington's soldiers had excavated. You'll notice a lot of water around those posts. That's why they survive. Again, this is a very marshy area, and the sodden soils help create an anaerobic environment. And with limited amount of oxygen, wood like this could preserve. Also keep in mind that the French torched the fort after Washington surrendered. So these posts here, I haven't actually read this recently. I think they may have been burned. Water preserved portion of stockade. Yeah, in the notes here, it doesn't say anything about, charred portion, the very upper portion charred. Anyway, it's preserved. And so this is Harrington's interpretation of what he thought it looked like. This earthenwork with a stockade and a log cabin in the center, again, for storing supplies. I have not been out there in recent years, so I'm not quite sure what all this looks like. But you can see this low earthenwork running around, and it's really too low. It would have had to have been more substantial to provide any protection, 2-3 times higher. The stockade, and then inside the log house where he'd store supplies. And you can see a small field piece over here. He apparently had several of those, not big field artillery pieces. So here's a drawing showing the battle and how it occurred. So you got the French approaching. You've got Virginia and South Carolina troops kind of forming around the creek, the fort in the center. French and Indians coming down from these forested heights here. And look at here's a scale here. So the distance between the forested heights and the fort is 200 feet, maybe, easily within musket fire. So this is really and you can see it's labeled here, wooded hillside, wooded hillside. This is really a very poor strategic location. Keep in mind, George Washington at the time was about 24 years old. He had no military experience to speak of. He was mostly a land surveyor. He'd go out with land survey crews, so that was kind of his business.
Jim, we have a note in the chat that I wanted to read aloud.
Sure.
Ben says, I was there last year, and that is still what the fort looks like. As a side note, NPS is currently replanting trees to bring the tree line back to where it was in 1754.
Thank you. That is very useful. Yeah, most of that area, like most of the Chesapeake area, was deforested in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so that was probably all pasture land there. But that's a great idea, replanting the trees, because it gives you a better sense of the defensive position Washington had created. But all those trees there, the French and Indians would have had plenty of cover, and Washington would have had very little. As to the earthenwork, they probably need to take another look at that. It's so low, it's barely a berm. I mean, what possible function could that serve? So he surrendered with military honors on July 3rd, 1754. So this whole action's taking place over about 5-6 weeks. And so we might ask, well, who's to blame for the defeat? Is this Washington's fault? Or did the Virginia governor, Dinwiddie, who sent Washington there, is it his fault? The defensive position that Washington took, I think, is kind of inexperience. That's his fault. Although he wouldn't have been able to defend himself no matter what he had out there. But it was Governor Robert Dinwiddie who sent them there and actually encouraged him to pick a fight with the French. Robert Dinwiddie was trying to provoke a war with the French. We've got a number of his communications that go back to London, basically pushing for this sort of fight. And it's interesting because as he's doing that, we have governors up in the Northeast, particularly governors of Massachusetts, who are doing the same thing. So this is a fight, and it's provoked not by the people in Great Britain, it's provoked by British settlers here in North America. Here's Robert Dinwiddie's letter to Lord Halifax, who's head of Board of Trade. They have several different offices, I don't recall exactly which, but I'll read it for you. The invasion and wicked designs of the French on the River Ohio has given me a continual uneasiness, which was increased by the supine and unaccountable obstinacy of the assemblies of the different colonies on this continent. Yet though they were convinced of the progress they had made and the threatening speeches they gave out, they could not be roused from their lethargic indolence to grant suitable supplies for conducting an expedition so necessary for their own safety. This is really a key thing when looking at looking at that road to independence, in that the different colonies were not working together. They were separate. They were jealous of one another, and they really refused to provide any help in counteracting the French. The exception, again, being Massachusetts, which was really keen on taking Acadia. And we'll get to that next month. So the following year, after Washington's lack of success, although apparently he was lauded as a hero when he got back to Williamsburg. But the next thing on the agenda is the Battle of Monongahela. And the British, they did this in the French and Indian War. They also did it in the American Revolution. They like these and War of 1812. They like these pincer type attacks. They like to attack a number of different points simultaneously and then gradually bring their forces together. So this is the attack plan. It's labeled the attack plan for the Braddock campaign, but Braddock was only he was focused on coming up from Virginia and attacking Fort Duquesne. The other governors would lead their forces at other attack points. The yellow dots there represent British sites. Again, this is not my drawing. And the dark circles are French sites. Braddock, you've probably everybody learned this in school. You know, he shows up, he's got these British regulars in their scarlet uniforms and their big hats, and a huge wagon train carrying all kinds of stuff. And they basically build a road as they're going from Virginia up to Fort Duquesne, which really slows things down. Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, his job was to attack Fort Niagara, basically the Buffalo area in New York. And William Johnson wasn't really a military guy, he was a settler. He was going to attack Crown Point. And then Robert Monckton was supposed to lead forces up really from the Boston area and from Newfoundland to attack basically the French Maritimes. And the British Navy would provide support for the northern operation. Obviously, the Navy wouldn't be very helpful in the others. Oh, I already showed you that. I probably had a reason for putting it there, but anyway. So this is a note, again, from Robert Dinwiddie, the governor, now to his Council of Maryland. The great and important business of the Ohio River Valley, we have always considered in a national light, not as Virginians, but as Britons, and what difficulties will not a Briton surmount? What dangers will he not encounter when he is engaged in the glorious cause of his king and country? That's BS. As these, sir, are our sentiments, we hope your honor will be persuaded of our ready and cheerful concurrence, and of our hearty endeavors to do everything on our part to promote His Majesty's services, the prosperity of this colony, and the welfare of America. Now, the reason the Council of Virginia is writing this to Governor Dinwiddie is that they are interested, unlike the other colonies, they see the Ohio as basically part of the Virginia colony. And they see a great deal of wealth there in beaver pelts, but also as in potential agricultural land, minerals, etc. So the Virginia elite are very interested in pursuing this war. Maryland, not really. Pennsylvania, most of the other states, not so much. So Braddock shows up, and his mission is to take Fort Duquesne and then proceed north up to Fort Niagara, where he would join forces with the other governors. The battle they never actually made it to Fort Duquesne, but the battle occurred on July 9th, 1755. So this is almost a year to the day of Washington's surrender. There were 300 to 900 Indians from various groups and only about 30 French colonial troops. This is pretty typical French campaigns is that they've got some French officers and regular military, but they're really supplemented by large numbers of Native Americans because they've convinced them that it's in their interest to do this. Braddock leads 2 regiments of British and American colonials. His aide-de-camp is George Washington, not surprisingly, because George knew the way. He had experience there, but he's still a young guy. Washington, in the end, the French and Indians ambushed the British column, which, you've probably seen many films about that era and later. The British like these long columns that go on forever and ever, and that exposed them to attack with their long wagon trains and a lot of unnecessary equipment. And so they got badly beaten. Washington, and this is kind of gives you a little more insight into his character, his military his approach, and that is he formed the rear guard. He basically got enough soldiers together to, working within military discipline to protect the retreating column. But in any case, it was disastrous. Braddock died, lost a lot of soldiers. This was what they were aiming for Fort Duquesne. Now, this is a model of what it might have looked like, but it was a classic European style fort with all sorts of projecting bastions and just, in fact, it looks a lot like Fort Cumberland, which we'll see in a few moments. So we have a map that basically describes the battle. Again, these are kind of typical military battle maps that people have drawn over the years with these rectangles generally representing different units. But they were, they were very orderly going in, but when they were ambushed, they panicked. And that's probably why they lost so many people. They did not maintain military discipline. Also, they were wearing those bright scarlet uniforms, which made them great targets. It has a color version of it. If you ever look at Civil War maps from Gettysburg and Antietam, you'll see a very similar kind of approach to mapping these things out. But you could see the British forces moving westward, to your left, and encountering the French and Indians, which are depicted as a series of rectangles as well, but that's not how it worked. The French and Indians were dispersed throughout the woods. They did not form battle lines the way the British were accustomed to doing. And it's that tactic, in part, that resulted in Braddock's defeat. And again, there are lots of images of these things, especially from the 19th century, Romantic period of art. You could see the Native Americans and French just kind of not in any particular formation. You could see the British in the background being shot off the officers being shot off their horses. Most of the soldiers would have been on foot. So George Washington's description: the front was attacked, and by the unusual hallooing and whooping of the enemy, whom they could not see, were so disconcerted and confused as soon to fall into irretrievable disorder. The rear was forced forward to support them, but seeing no enemy, because they're hiding behind trees, and themselves falling every moment from the fire, a general panic took place among the troops, from which no exertions of the officers could recover them. I've talked about, Little Bighorn battle with Custer, different Civil War period battles. Loss of military discipline, loss of order is really what results in massive casualties. But Washington lays it out here in a relatively few words. What surprises me in that first sentence: and by the unusual hallooing and whooping of the enemy. The British, maybe they weren't doing this before them, but the British like to march into battle with bagpipes playing. As the son of a piper, let me tell you, talk about unnerving. This is again, a Romantic era painting that shows the British looking actually pretty good there, except for General Edward Braddock, who is dead. And what they're doing is they're burying him in the middle of the road that they created, and then marching and moving their wagons over his grave so as to basically camouflage it and keep the French and Indians from exhuming and desecrating the corpse. So we don't know exactly where Braddock is buried. The results, about 450 killed and nearly as many wounded. So nearly 900 losses, facing a force of under 900. Losing Braddock, of course. Fewer than 30 Indians and French killed, fewer than 20 wounded. So a catastrophic loss. A great embarrassment. And I tell you, once news got back, especially to the Annapolis area, people were afraid. They were afraid of being scalped in their beds in Annapolis. They were, they thought they would be attacked by a massive French and Indian onslaught, which of course never occurred. So what happened? Well, with the loss of Braddock and everybody's scared, there was no longer any British protection out there on the frontier, with one exception I'll get to in a moment. The British Army was terribly embarrassed. I mean, basically this, fearsome force, the envy of much of the world, at least Europe, got their butts kicked by several hundred Indians, and it didn't look good for them. And of course, they lost their commanding general. So the Indians ended up really repossessing the land. They extended out to, say, Frederick, Maryland. And again, people in Annapolis, they were scared to hell. Some of the prominent participants in that expedition: George Washington, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Gage, who became a British commander-in-chief of America in the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, Captain Horatio Gates, Major General in the Continental Army, Captain Charles Lee, Major General in the Continental Army, James Craik, Washington's physician general, who also was one of three physicians who were there at Washington's death in December of 1799. James Craik lived just east of Port Tobacco, about a mile. And Captain William Mercer, who was also Major General in the Continental Army. And among the guys running the wagons, Daniel Boone and Daniel Morgan. Now, the idea was, okay, the survivors of the two regiments would regroup under Colonel Dunbar. He would winter at Philadelphia and then march to Fort Niagara. Now, this happened in early July of 1755, middle of the summer, and he's already thinking about wintering in Philadelphia. But it would have taken him a little bit of time to march over there and to regroup, take care of the wounded, and resupply. But Fort Niagara was their ultimate destination. Fort Cumberland, a lot of folks never heard of this place, but it was in what is now Cumberland. And I don't know how well you can see it. I should probably do this in white, but I've got a dashed black rectangle that shows the approximate location of where the fort was. There's churches here. And the fort looks something like this. So the left part is your classic European fort with these bastions sticking out, and that allows crossfire. If this were just a square, your enemy can come right up to the walls and essentially be protected as long as they stay close to the wall. But the bastions allow that crossfire. Coming off of that fort, heading out to the point in the river, you have much less substantial stockade in which you have a parade ground and housing for the garrison, whether it's frame buildings or tents. But this is sort of where daily life in the garrison would occur. And then under attack, if they can't hold this position, then they retreat into the fort. So here's Washington. We got some interesting letters from him about this situation. Keep in mind that at this point, George Washington is the commandant of Fort Cumberland. And most people don't know that about his military career. He actually commanded a garrison in what is now Cumberland, for a couple of years. I tremble at the consequences that this defeat may have upon our back settlers. By that, it means backcountry settlers, those folks who are out on the frontier, who I suppose will all leave their habitations unless there are proper measures taken for their security. Colonel Dunbar, who commands at present, intends, as soon as his men are recruited at this place, to continue his march to Philadelphia for winter quarters. Consequently, there will be no men left here unless it is the shattered remains of the Virginia troops, who are totally inadequate to the protection of the frontiers. He was entirely correct. Mostly he stayed pinned inside his fort and often seeing his own men or settlers killed right outside the fort by Indians.
Jim,
Led
I
to a
have a few
great
questions in the chat. Sorry to interrupt.
far away.
Robert says, number one, isn't it General Hugh Mercer who died at the Battle of Princeton as opposed to William Mercer? And number two, were Shirley's, Johnson's, and Monckton's attacks successful?
Well, surely, yes, attacking Acadia. I'm not as well versed in what was going on along the St. Lawrence. And that would be a third talk on this, but I'm not competent to speak about that. As to which Mercer is which, I defer to his greater knowledge. I'm not as familiar with the individuals involved.
Shirley was the one that attacked Niagara. He was not successful.
Oh, okay. I was thinking of the Massachusetts effort in Acadia.
And that was Monckton, I think. Not
Moncton,
Monckton. Yeah.
yeah, it was Moncton.
And Johnson was attempting to attack Ticonderoga, which was his goal. But he got pinned down at Lake George, which is what you're probably going to talk about next week.
Yeah, with your help, yeah. Next week, next month, what I'd like to do is talk about the Northern Theater of War. Ray, who you just heard speaking, has worked on some of the excavations up there. You know, so we've got some pictures to work with and kind of an interesting story. I should be clear, this is not my area of specialty, but the general themes that run through are because they do lead to independence.
Mm-hmm.
Were there other questions? None? Okay. So again, here's the fort, and Washington was basically kind of stuck there and was getting really quite frustrated, one might say angry. Again, the fort doesn't survive, but you know, people build models, and this is a model of what that fort might have looked like. I don't think there's been any archaeology done there because of the amount of redevelopment, but there are some tunnels that survive. I suspect are much later. So this is Washington writing to Governor Dinwiddie, who's basically his mentor. And this is in 1757. So now we're talking nearly 2 years after Braddock's defeat. We have been at a good deal of unavoidable expense and trouble to furnish the Indians with such things as they wanted. That is, the Indians friendly to the British cause. Some hostile Indians killed 2 Catawbas on Thursday last, about 150 yards from the fort, so just outside of rifle range probably, and 70 from a sentry, and made their escape, though pursued by other Catawbas and near 200 men. And the day before yesterday, 2 soldiers were killed and a third taken prisoner as they were coming to this place from the fort below. The rest of the party, being 10 in number, with Captain Wagoner among them, made their escape. So Washington's basically seeing this from his perch up on this upland above the river, and there's not a hell of a lot he could do about it. And he's really beginning to steam. This to John Robinson, who's a speaker for Virginia House of Burgesses, and now another year later, in 1758, so a little more than 3 years after Braddock's defeat. That appearance of glory, which we had once in view, that is, kicking out the French, that hope, that laudable ambition of serving our country and meriting its applause are now no more. All is dwindled into ease, sloth, and fatal inactivity. But we who view the actions of great men at a distance can only form conjectures. There's some coded language in here. And being ignorant of the comprehensive schemes, might mistake egregiously in judging of things from appearances or by the lump. Yet every fool will have his notions. The conduct of our leaders, if not actuated by superior orders, is tempered with something I do not care to give a name to. Washington is writing this letter to a powerful politician in Virginia, and he's basically calling somebody a coward because it's taking a long time for a counterattack against the French at Fort Duquesne. And so when he starts off that appearance of glory, etc. For one thing, this gives a little insight into Washington. It's important to him how he is perceived, and we see that in much of his subsequent life. He was very attuned to what people thought of him. But he's talking about, essentially life in the fort. It has dwindled into ease, sloth, and fatal activity. That is, they're basically sitting around in the fort. They can't do anything. They don't have the forces they need to adequately attack the French. But he's waiting for General Forbes to bring a large army westward across Pennsylvania that he could join and attack Fort Duquesne. But Forbes, seeing what happened to Braddock, is very cautious. And what he was doing was he built a series of forts into which he could retreat or call forth additional supplies and reinforcements as he crossed Pennsylvania. So it was taking him so long because he was building a string of forts behind him. And so, Washington is saying the conduct of our leaders, and he's clearly referring to Forbes and maybe others, if not actuated by superior orders, that is, assuming the king or whatever isn't telling them to do something else, is tempered with something I do not care to give a name to, and that really is cowardice. If he wrote that today and got caught, he'd be drummed out of the military, as I think General Stanley McChrystal found out in more recent years. So here's an image of General Forbes, and you can see it's called Forbes Road. He's building these forts as he approaches Fort Duquesne. Again, Washington's speakers continue this letter. We have certain intelligence that the French strength at Fort Duquesne on the 13th of the last did not exceed 800 men, Indians included, of whom there appeared to be about 300 or 400. This account is corroborated on all hands, spies. See, therefore, how our time has been misspent. Behold, how the golden opportunity has been lost, perhaps never more to be regained. Braddock originally had a force of 1,500 behind him. I don't know what Forbes had, but presumably it was considerably larger. And here they were going to attack, 800. How is it to be accounted for? Can General Forbes have orders for this? Impossible. Will then our injured country pass by such abuses? I hope not. Again, today's military, if you got caught writing something like that, you'd be out of a job. And this is to the new governor of Virginia from Washington, from Fort Duquesne. He wrote this. I have the pleasure to inform you that Fort Duquesne, or the ground rather on which it stood, was possessed by His Majesty's troops on the 25th. The enemy, after letting us get within a day's march of the place, burned the fort and ran away by the light of it at night, going down the Ohio by water, to the number of about 500 men, according to our best information. This possession of the fort has been matter of surprise to the whole army, and we cannot attribute it to more probable causes than the weakness of the enemy, want of provisions, and the defection of their Indians. And subsequently, it's been discovered that that's exactly what happened. The Indians took their leave, leaving a relatively small French force. But basically, they took so long to attack Fort Duquesne, the French just sort of, maybe they got tired of waiting for them, I don't know. but they torched the fort and retreated downriver. So no action, which for a lot of people, and I suspect like George Washington, they probably, had mixed feelings about, because you can't have honor in fighting for crown and country if the enemy retreats before you. So what do we learn from all this? We got Anglo-French tensions that go back a century, not new, but they're aggravated by frustrated settlement expansion. At the end of King George's War, the Crown said, okay, we will not allow settlement beyond the mountains. We will not allow settlement into the Ohio, which was controlled by the French. The settlers, English, mostly English settlers, wanted to move west. And it does raise an interesting question of why that is so. At the time of the French and Indian War, there was, maybe 2 million people in an area that's now occupied by, I don't know how many tens of millions of Americans. Why this need to move west? Not everybody wanted to go trap beavers. And it makes me wonder if perhaps we're not beginning to see some degradation of the land, of agricultural land, and that folks really want to move west to find better land for better farming. It's a hypothesis that could be tested. France and Great Britain were both fighting for hegemony in this part of the world. Again, for both kingdoms, it was a huge, empires. The resources were incredible. The amount of wealth that the British Crown got from Virginia alone was immense, never mind the Caribbean islands, plus all kinds of raw materials. It started out with a small force led by junior officers on both sides, because the French didn't have a senior guy out there either, and that ended up precipitating the hot war. Again, George Washington was acclaimed a hero when he returned to Williamsburg, despite somewhat questionable judgment in attacking the French and Indians to begin with, and then building a fort in Great Meadows. Braddock's defeat created opportunities for these 2 junior officers, and I might say young officers, to rise through the ranks, to develop reputations. George Washington was particularly impatient and insubordinate. I don't really know much about Colonel John Durham. It should be Dunbar. It's worth pursuing. So next month, I'd like to talk about the northern frontier. New York, focusing on that a little bit because, again, Ray has done some work up there with our late friend David Starbuck. And Acadia, which I find really interesting because a lot of the French neutrals who were forced out of Acadia ended up coming down to Maryland, which leads to another interesting story. So anyway, that's about what I have. I'm open to any questions that I will try to answer. Again, I'm not a historian. I'm not a specialist in this area.
Yeah, Jim, I think your hypothesis on the movement of people west was definitely agricultural related. Massachusetts people were moving into New York because the land was so much better there, and they had a lot of rocky land to farm in Massachusetts.
Yeah, so they moved to parts of New York that were equally rocky.
Exactly. But then, well, except for down in the Mohawk Valley.
Yeah.
And that was a very rich farmland. And
yeah.
The problem they had there was such a mix of different ethnicities in that area. A lot of them were forcing the Palatine Germans to move down more into Pennsylvania, into that Wyoming Valley in that area. So I think there's some credibility to that hypothesis. Yeah,
now in Maryland, we've got, we have some rocky land once you start getting out west, but we have large coastal plain, we have pretty decent Piedmont. What's the rush? Why this push to move west? Doesn't quite make sense to me unless we start looking at it in terms of environment. The other thing that happens, and I know not in Maryland and Virginia, but certainly up in New England, New York, eventually we have I guess they're viruses that attack wheat, rust it's called. And that did push a lot of folks out towards the Genesee Valley. But I think that's a little bit later. I don't think they were really battling these pathogens. I suspect it has to do with just wearing out the land very quickly.
Yeah.
Yep, we have a question in the chat from Robert. And it says, although Washington appears to criticize Forbes for building outposts, isn't that the smart thing to do? The British set up a series of outposts in New Jersey while pursuing Washington across New Jersey to the Delaware River. Likewise, the British set up a number of posts in South Carolina during their Southern campaign, for example, Fort 96, etc.
Yeah, I'm not saying that George Washington thought it was a foolhardy thing to do. I'm saying that George Washington was impatient for action, and being cloistered in that fort in what is now Cumberland was really getting on his nerves. He he I mean, he was a bit reckless the year before, or 2 years before. Um, I think that's it. I don't think he was questioning the wisdom. I think he was he was just taking too long. He was impatient. And also, there's no glory in building forts. There's no glory in commanding a garrison out in the middle of nowhere. For him, the glory is, and most people I think who go into that kind of work is, to engage the enemy, to distinguish yourself. And he was not getting that opportunity. Ironically, his later military career was mostly, just a very well planned, constant withdrawal before the enemy. And he was making the British as impatient and as frustrated as Washington was back in Cumberland because they couldn't catch up to him, constantly chasing them. So I don't know. It makes it part of looking at this stuff is we see the development of some of these personalities, as well as what I didn't get into this evening is the creating of these relationships across colonies, which really didn't exist prior to the French and Indian War. Other questions, comments, criticisms, complaints?
Well, I think one of the things too that probably caused some of the conflict is that the treaties that were signed in the previous wars before the French and Indian War didn't really define the borders very well because they did not know that territory.
Yeah.
And so there was a constant bickering back and forth of where those boundaries actually were laid. And you'd see the French going down, actually, I forget the name of the guy that did it, but was actually walking down trying to lay these big lead plates saying, this is French territory. And the Indians just kind of looked at him and laughed.
Yeah, well, the British were saying, no, it isn't.
Yeah.
And so they were inclined to pull them up. And the thing is, Washington was was an experienced surveyor, as experienced as you could be at anything at age 24, 25. And so he had some familiarity with that backcountry.
Yeah.
Which greatly expanded after the Revolutionary War. He was a big land speculator, although didn't profit from it in his later years. He said, "Damn, I'm sorry I went and acquired all this land because it's more trouble than it's worth."
Yeah.
He's constantly going out to the western lands and evicting squatters, and so he had almost 100,000 acres of western lands by the time he died. But that was what the Virginians were after. They wanted that land. I don't see that with Maryland.
Yeah, well, it was contested too because Connecticut claimed part of Pennsylvania going out that way to the west, which was kind of interesting. New York claimed part of it. So there was that bickering between the colonies at that point too.
And that carried right on up until the 1770s,
Yeah.
as we started coalescing in a united front, is that several of these states had to give up their pretense to these western lands, because the way their boundaries, their boundaries, there was no western boundary for these patented colonies. Northern and southern ones.
You look at the maps; it's just a straight line that just goes all the way across.
Yeah, Virginia, Connecticut, they could extend it to California. And so they had to surrender their claims to that land in order to really unite with the other colonies.
Yeah.
So we'll deal with some of that next month. Again, it's going to still be more military and a little more archaeology. And then the subsequent talks are going to be more based more on texts, what these people are saying, what they're doing.
And we have a comment in the chat from Robert, and it says, FYI, there is a brick outline of Fort Duquesne in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I don't know what that's based on, if that's based on archaeology or somebody's supposition. I'm not familiar with the archaeology that's been done there. I mean, that area is pretty heavily developed, but I'll look into it and see if there's an archaeology report available. Yeah, things come up, somebody needs to dig a sewer line, and so they're required to do archaeology. People like me go out there, dig some holes, and we find, 3 feet of wooden post stuck in the ground deep down and go, hey, there we go. So I'll look into that for next month. Okay, well, thank you all. It's good to see you all.